Hello there, and welcome back. Tonight we are going to ride slowly through one of the quietest and most revealing parts of Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur Morgan's journal. Not the gunfights, not the robberies, not Dutch's speeches, not even the final ride by itself, but the small worn book Arthur carries through snow, mud, campfire smoke, sickness, guilt, wonder, and finally absence. The journal is easy to miss if the story is only remembered by its loudest moments, but once it is noticed, it becomes one of the deepest pieces of Arthur Morgan's lore. It is where a feared outlaw becomes a private observer. It is where the man who says little draws everything. So settle in gently. Let the camp grow quiet. Let the pencil move softly over paper. Tonight we are following Arthur through the pages he leaves behind. Arthur's journal matters because it shows a version of him that the gang does not always get to see. Around camp, Arthur is often rough, sarcastic, practical and guarded. He jokes when he feels too much, complains when he is helping, and hides tenderness behind insults. Because tenderness is dangerous in the life he has chosen. But inside the journal, he can slow down. He can notice the curve of a bird's wing, the shape of a church roof, the tired face of a stranger, the strange beauty of a landscape he may never see again. The journal does not make Arthur innocent. It makes him visible. It lets the quieter part of him breathe. The first important thing about the journal is that Arthur, a man living by robberies, debt collection, violence and escape, does not need a notebook to survive. It does not feed the gang. It does not stop bullets. It does not keep Pinkertons away. Yet Arthur carries it across states, mountains, swamps, cities, islands and camps. He opens it in stolen pauses, writes what happened, sketches what, and leaves pieces of himself on pages nobody is supposed to judge. That choice tells us Arthur has always had an interior life deeper than his job in the journal is also a practical object, and that matters. It is not presented as a magical diary or a dramatic confession written for history. It feels like something Arthur actually uses. The pages are filled with notes, maps, drawings, reminders, thoughts, and fragments of memory. Some entries are brief, some are careful, some are funny, bitter, or sad. Some drawings are detailed enough to feel like he sat still for longer than he would admit. The book feels handled, carried, opened, closed, and returned to the satchel. It belongs to the road as much as his revolver does. There is a deep contrast between Arthur's hands as the world sees them and Arthur's hands as the journal reveals them. In the story, those hands beat men, hold guns, collect debts, skin animals, pull reins, punch, threaten, and drag bodies through danger. But those same hands also draw delicate feathers, buildings, faces, trees, bridges, horses, insects, fish, plants, and little details of rooms. The journal lets the same hand become gentle without pretending it was never violent. That is why it feels so important. It does not erase Arthur's brutality. It complicates it. Arthur's drawings are not decorative extras. They are evidence of attention. Many outlaws in the gang look at the world through need. Where is the money? Where is the law? Where is the threat? Where is the next place to hide? Arthur sees those things too. But he also sees shape, mood, and texture. He sees the way a town sits in mud, the way a horse stands, the way a river bends, the way an animal carries itself before it runs. The journal reveals that Arthur's eye is not deadened by violence. Something in him is still open enough to notice beauty. That makes the journal one of the strongest arguments that Arthur was never only Dutch's weapon. Dutch may have raised him to be loyal and useful. The gang may depend on him to enforce and protect. Enemies may know him as a dangerous man. But the pages show a person who is always quietly studying the world. The tragedy is that Arthur can see so much around him while failing, for a long time, to see the full truth of the life he serves. His eyes are awake before his conscience is fully free. The journal also keeps a record of contradiction. Arthur may write with humour after doing something cruel. He may draw a peaceful landscape while living as part of a gang that leaves suffering behind. He may observe a stranger with care and later threaten another stranger for money. This does not make the journal false. It makes it honest in a way polished confession would not be. A person's inner life is rarely one clean line. Arthur's pages hold tenderness and denial together, because Arthur himself holds tenderness and denial together. Long before the mountain, before the diagnosis, before the final acts of sacrifice, the journal suggests that Arthur has the soul of someone who might have lived differently. He has an artist's patience buried inside an outlaw's body. He has a writer's self-awareness buried under a gang member's loyalty. He has a naturalist's interest in animals, weather and land, even though his life keeps pulling him toward crimes and escapes. The journal is heartbreaking because it proves the better Arthur was not created only by sickness. That better Arthur was already there, waiting for enough truth to reach him. At the beginning of the story, the gang is running from Blackwater, but the journal carries the feeling of a history we are not fully allowed to see. Arthur writes from the aftermath, not from a clean beginning. The ferry job has gone wrong. People are dead. Money is lost. Trust is shaken. The gang climbs into the grizzlies and disappears into snow. The journal does not solve the mystery of Blackwater, and that is part of its power. It begins with damage already present, like a book opened after several pages have been torn away. Coulter gives the journal a cold beginning. The gang is trapped in the mountains, and Arthur's world is narrowed to shelter, food, wounded people, and survival. His notes from this period carry the bluntness of crisis. There is no room yet for grand reflection. The snow is too heavy, the people too tired, the danger too close. But even here, the journal establishes Arthur as someone who records what is happening while living through it. He is not outside the story, calmly describing it. He is inside the storm, writing from the middle of it. That matters, because Arthur's journal is not written after everything is understood. It is not a perfect memoir. It is immediate, limited, and changing. Arthur writes before he knows the ending. He writes while still trusting Dutch, while still resenting John, while still doing Strauss's collections, while still believing the gang might recover. The pages are full of dramatic irony, because the person reading them later knows more than the man writing them then. The journal becomes painful because it preserves Arthur's old beliefs before life breaks them open. The rescue of John in the mountains reveals how the journal quietly supports what the cutscenes show. Arthur complains about John, mocks him, and calls him foolish, but he still rides into terrible weather to bring him home. In the pages, Arthur's descriptions of people often carry that same mix of irritation and care. He rarely sounds sentimental in an easy way. He notices weakness, stupidity, vanity, and trouble, but the act of writing people down gives them weight. Even when he is annoyed, he is paying attention. For Arthur, attention is often the closest thing to affection he can safely admit. John's place in the journal grows more important because the book eventually becomes John's inheritance. At first, John is one of Arthur's frustrations, a younger brother who ran off, abandoned Abigail and Jack, and returned expecting to belong again. But by the end, John becomes the life Arthur tries to push forward. The journal's later handoff makes their relationship physical. Arthur does not simply tell John to live. The world itself gives John the pages Arthur carried, and John continues inside the same book. The notebook becomes a bridge between two broken men. Horseshoe Overlook gives the journal room to breathe after the snow. The camp sits above the heartlands, the weather warms, Valentine lies nearby, and for a while the gang can pretend that the disaster in Blackwater was only a setback. Arthur's pages during this broader stretch begin to hold more of the world. The land opens. There are animals, towns, strangers, missions, jokes, and small discoveries. The journal becomes more than a survival record. It becomes a companion to wandering. This is where Arthur's observational nature becomes especially clear. The heartlands are not exotic compared with later places like Saint Denis or Guarma, but Arthur still notices them. Rolling grass, ranches, muddy roads, birds, trees, rivers, and the ordinary life of Valentine all find space in his world. This is important because Arthur does not only draw the rare and spectacular, he draws what is near. He records the common world with the same basic respect he gives the strange. That kind of attention reveals a man who could have been content with quieter things, if life had allowed him to trust quiet. Valentine itself is perfect for Arthur's journal, because it is rough, muddy, loud, and full of ordinary human mess. It is not civilization in a polished form. It is cattle, saloons, drunks, working people, law, gossip and streets churned by hooves and wheels. Arthur's pages do not need to romanticize it. The town is interesting because it is alive. His journal records that aliveness through buildings, people, and fragments of experience. Valentine shows the world Arthur claims to stand outside of, even while he constantly enters it for money, supplies, and trouble. The journal also carries Arthur's humour. He can be dry, dismissive, and funny in ways that reveal intelligence sharper than he usually advertises. Around camp, humour helps him manage discomfort. In the journal, humour becomes part of how he processes the absurdity of the life he lives. Red Dead Redemption 2 is full of sadness, but Arthur is not only sad. His private writing can be amused, annoyed, or quietly mocking. That keeps the journal from becoming one note. It feels like a real notebook, because not every page understands the tragedy yet. One of the most touching things about the journal is how often Arthur draws animals. Horses, birds, fish, deer, predators, and small creatures are not simply background details to him. He studies them. He records their bodies with patience. This matters because Arthur's relationship with animals is one of the places where his gentleness can appear without embarrassment. An animal does not ask him to confess. A horse does not require him to explain his past. A bird does not need him to be redeemed. Animals allow Arthur to look carefully, without being looked through. Arthur's horse, though not the journal's only animal presence, belongs deeply to this private world. The bond between Arthur and his horse becomes one of the quiet emotional threads of the story, and the journal's wider attention to animals helps prepare that feeling. He is a man who can use horses roughly because his life demands speed and escape, but he can also brush, feed, calm, and rely on them. The horses travel, survival, companionship, and silence. Arthur's drawings of animals make that silent companionship feel part of his whole way of seeing. The hunting and fishing notes in Arthur's life also matter because they slow the story down. A man who hunts must read signs. A man who fishes must wait. A man who sketches what he catches or sees must accept stillness, at least for a moment. These activities reveal a rhythm different from robbery. They do not redeem Arthur by themselves, but they show he is capable of patience, care, and craft. The journal preserves those slower rhythms, making the wilderness feel like the place where Arthur's spirit can stretch out. The legendary animal drawings give the journal a folklore quality. These creatures are not only resources or trophies, they become encounters with the land's older presence. Arthur's sketches turn them into memory, almost like field notes from a private mythology. The West in Red Dead Redemption 2 is already fading under modern pressure, and these animals feel like part of what is disappearing, rare, powerful, specific, and tied to places people will soon cross with railroads, fences, and industry. Arthur records them like a man unknowingly recording a vanishing world. Plants and herbs reveal another side of the journal. Arthur gathers, identifies, and records pieces of the land that are easy to overlook. Flowers, roots, berries, mushrooms, and herbs become part of the same attentive habit as animals and buildings. This is not the grand violence of the outlaw story. It is the humble knowledge of someone who spends a life outdoors. The journal's botany makes Arthur feel connected to survival in an older way. He knows the land not only as a hiding place, but as something that can heal, poison, feed, and mark the seasons. The journal's sketches of buildings and towns show Arthur's quiet interest in human design. A church, a saloon, a house, a barn, a dock, a bridge, or a city street can become worth drawing. That means he is not only interested in nature, he studies how people build their lives too. This is especially sad because Arthur himself has no lasting home. He draws other people's structures while living in camps that must always be packed and abandoned. His pages gather buildings because his life cannot keep one. Camp itself is one of the journal's great hidden subjects. The gang is always talking, arguing, singing, working, resting, and shifting around Arthur. And the journal helps us understand that camp is not merely a menu or a safe place. It is a temporary society. Arthur's writing and drawings preserve the people in it as more than mission partners. They become faces, voices, habits, annoyances, and attachments. The journal gives the gang texture before the story begins stripping people away. Dutch appears in the journal as leader, father figure, and eventually problem. Early Arthur still sees Dutch through. He may notice Dutch's flaws, but he does not yet understand them as fatal. That gradual shift is one of the quietest arcs in the book. Dutch does not transform in one entry from hero to fraud. Instead, the pages slowly change temperature. Faith becomes concern. Concern becomes doubt. Doubt becomes grief. The journal is where Arthur's loyalty begins to loosen before his mouth can fully say it. Hosea's presence in Arthur's private world feels different. Hosea is often tied to memory, steadiness, and old wisdom. Arthur can joke with him, learn from him, and understand him without needing the same dramatic worship that Dutch demands. The pages never have to announce Hosea as Arthur's better father figure. The story shows it through warmth, trust, and the sadness that follows Hosea's death. When Hosea is gone, the gang loses more than a planner. Arthur loses one of the last people who could slow Dutch down. Lenny's place in Arthur's memory is especially tender, because Lenny represents youth, intelligence, and a future the gang claims to protect, but cannot actually provide. Arthur's journal and the story around it make Lenny feel remembered, not just used. The drunken night in Valentine, their conversations, and Lenny's place at camp all show Arthur's respect growing naturally. When Lenny dies, the loss cuts through Arthur because it is not abstract. A young man he laughed with is gone. The journal's world becomes emptier because the camp's bright voices keep disappearing. Sean brings a different kind of life to the gang. He is loud, foolish, funny, and often irritating, but his return from captivity fills camp. Arthur's writing around these moments helps preserve the fact that the gang was not always only dread. There were parties, songs, laughter, teasing, and the temporary feeling that people could come back from danger. Sean's later death in Rhodes is so shocking because the journal has allowed the warmth of his presence to exist first. A page can remember what a bullet ends. Kieran's presence in the gang is another test of Arthur's way of seeing. At first, Kieran is an O'Driscoll, an enemy, a prisoner, and a target for suspicion. Over time, he becomes nervous, useful, loyal in his own frightened way, and finally tragic. Arthur's journal can register this kind of shift better than a simple plot summary. People change categories in his mind. Enemy can become camp member, fool can become friend, burden can become loss. The journal records Arthur's slow ability to notice people beyond the labels given by gang loyalty. Micah is different because the journal never needs to uncover some hidden softness in him. His presence corrodes the camp. He flatters Dutch, provokes violence, insults weakness, and brings out the worst meanings of freedom. Arthur's private reactions to Micah fit the broader emotional truth. Arthur dislikes him almost instinctively, but Dutch keeps letting Micah closer. The journal becomes part of the slow horror of watching Arthur see danger, while still being unable to save the family from the man Dutch chooses. Strauss is important to the journal because the debt ledger and Arthur's notebook are moral opposites. Strauss records what people owe. Arthur records what things feel like. Strauss's world is numbers, interest, obligation, and pressure applied to weakness. Arthur's journal is images, remorse, weather, confusion, and memory. The Downs collection ties these worlds together. Arthur acts as Strauss's body, but later the journal becomes the place where the cost of that role can no longer be ignored. Thomas Downs is one of the most important figures in Arthur's journal lore because he changes what the book becomes. Before Downs, the journal is already thoughtful, but after the sickness begins to reveal itself, every entry carries a different shadow. Arthur's body he coughs, weakens, changes colour, and feels time compressing around him. The journal becomes more urgent, not because it turns dramatic, but because the man writing it knows less and less how much road remains. The tuberculosis diagnosis is where the journal's private voice becomes devastating. Arthur hears that he is dying, and the book must now hold a truth his old life. A gang can plan another robbery, Dutch can promise another escape, Micah can sneer, Strauss can count. But the journal knows a simpler fact: Arthur's time is limited. From this point forward, the notebook becomes a place where every observation is touched by mortality. A bird, a street, a friend's face, a memory, a regret, all of it matters more, because there will be fewer pages. This is why Arthur's drawings after the diagnosis can feel different even when the subject is ordinary. A tree is still a tree, a horse is still a horse, a town is still a town. But the person drawing them is no longer pretending forever is available. The world becomes sharper because he is leaving it. No page has to say that in every line. The context says it. Arthur's eye becomes a dying man's eye, and the ordinary world becomes almost sacred through the fact that he will not be in it much longer. The honour system has a quiet relationship with the journal. Arthur's private words and drawings can shift depending on the life he is living, giving the notebook a moral texture. A more merciful Arthur sounds more open to regret and grace. A harsher Arthur can remain more bitter. But in either path, the journal is still an interior record of consequence. It reminds us that morality in the story is not only public reputation, it is also the voice a man must hear when nobody else is speaking. High Honour Arthur's journal feels like a man learning to tell the truth without making himself the hero of it. He does not become clean. He does not pretend the harm did not happen. Instead, he begins to understand that a few right actions near the end do not erase the past, but they can still matter. The journal supports this by becoming less defensive. It lets regret enter. It lets kindness feel less embarrassing. It lets Arthur admit, sometimes indirectly, that he wants something better for someone else. Low Honour Arthur's journal carries a different sadness. It can feel like a man who sees the darkness but cannot or will not step away from it fully. That path is not empty, because Arthur still knows he is dying and still lives inside the collapse of Dutch's dream. But the private voice can be harder, more cynical, less healed. This variation matters because the journal is not just a fixed text. It responds to the version of Arthur being lived. The notebook becomes a moral mirror, not a lecture. Mary Linton's letters belong beside the journal because both are forms of private writing. Mary's letters arrive from the life Arthur did not choose, and Arthur's journal absorbs the ache they reopen. When Mary asks for help, the old affection returns with all its frustration. Arthur writes like someone who knows he is foolish for caring and still cannot stop. The journal is where that contradiction can sit safely. In speech, Arthur can be short and embarrassed. On paper, the old wound has more room. The mission to help Jamie shows Arthur as a man who can still act from love without calling it love. He rides after a young man caught in a strange belief, talks him down and returns him to Mary. The journal's importance here is not only what Arthur records, but what the act reveals about the kind of stories he carries. Mary does not belong to the gang. Jamie does not help Dutch's plan. There is no big score. Arthur helps because his past asks him to, and the journal quietly remembers that he was capable of answering. When Mary later asks Arthur to run away with her, the journal carries one of the great, unrealised possibilities in his life. For a moment, an old door seems to open. There could be a train, a departure, a life outside the gang's endless emergencies, but Arthur is already too entangled, and soon he is also too ill. The tragedy is not that he feels nothing. The tragedy is that feeling arrives in a life that has made escape nearly impossible. The journal becomes a place where impossible tenderness can exist without becoming a future. Arthur's son Isaac and Isaac's mother Eliza are not only backstory, they are ghosts behind the journal's gentleness toward children and families. Arthur once had a child, and that child was murdered with his mother for almost nothing. Their absence matters even when the book only circles it indirectly. Every time Arthur thinks about John failing Jack, every time he protects a vulnerable person, every time he sees a family on the edge of ruin, the old wound is somewhere nearby. The notebook belongs to a man who already knows what cannot be restored. Jack Marston becomes one of the gentlest presences around Arthur. Taking Jack fishing is a small mission, but it has enormous emotional weight because it lets Arthur step into a protective role without the noise of outlaw business. The journal around Jack and the camp's family life helps show Arthur's buried fatherliness. He is awkward with softness, but he is not empty of it. Jack gives him a chance to be kind in a way the gang's crimes have not yet ruined. Abigail's presence sharpens that feeling. Arthur respects her more than he always says, and his frustration with John is partly rooted in seeing Abigail fight for a future John keeps failing to claim. The journal, as Arthur's private record, belongs near this slow recognition. Abigail is not dreaming of paradise. She is asking for safety, stability, and a father who stays. Arthur comes to understand that this wish is not weakness. It is the most sensible dream left in a gang addicted to impossible plans. Sadie Adler's transformation is another story the journal witnesses. When Arthur first meets her, she is a widow in shock, pulled from the ruins of her home after the O'Driscolls destroy her life. Over time, she becomes fierce, capable, reckless, wounded, and loyal in a way Arthur comes to respect deeply. The journal's world has room for this change because Arthur notices people becoming different under pressure. Sadie is not simply saved by the gang. She is altered by grief, and Arthur recognises the strength and danger in that alteration. Charles Smith is one of the few people whose quietness matches Arthur's. Their bond does not need loud declarations. Charles sees through empty talk, works hard, respects nature, and carries his own loneliness with dignity. Arthur's journal, with its attention to animals, landscape, and moral unease, feels spiritually close to Charles, even when it is not directly about him. Both men understand that survival should not mean disrespecting everything alive. Charles's presence helps Arthur's better instincts feel less isolated. The journal also helps show how Arthur relates to the women of the gang with more complexity than his rough exterior suggests. Tilly, Mary Beth, Karen, Susan Grimshaw, Abigail, Molly and Sadie all exist in the camp's emotional world, and Arthur's observations help keep camp from becoming only a story of men with guns. He may tease, argue, but he notices the labour that holds the group together: sewing, cooking, organising, caring, warning, entertaining, surviving. The journal preserves the gang as a community before it becomes only a collapse. Mary Beth is especially important because she is a reader and storyteller, someone who understands imagination differently from Arthur. Their camp conversations can feel gentle because she senses that Arthur has a hidden thoughtful side. The journal is proof that she is right. Arthur may not speak like a novelist, but he looks like one in private. He gathers scenes, faces, and moods. Mary Beth's presence reminds us that Arthur's inner life is not invisible to everyone. Some people in camp catch glimpses of it. Tilly's story brings another kind of attention. She has survived cruelty before the gang, and Arthur's protectiveness toward her is part of his better self. The journal's private world helps frame these moments not as simple side kindnesses, but as evidence of Arthur's changing moral focus. The gang taught him to protect the family, but over time he begins to understand protection beyond Dutch's definition. It is not only loyalty to the group, it is care for the vulnerable when power comes looking for them. Karen's decline is one of the camp's quieter tragedies, and the journal's attention to camp life makes that decline harder to ignore. She begins as lively, bold, funny, and capable, especially during the Valentine Bank job setup. Later, grief, drinking, and the gang's collapse seem to swallow her. Arthur's world records the atmosphere around that decline, even when it cannot save her. Not every tragedy in Red Dead Redemption 2 gets a grand final scene. Some people simply fade, while everyone is. Molly O'Shea's story also belongs to the journal's atmosphere of misread pain. Molly is lonely inside Dutch's circle, attached to a man whose attention has turned elsewhere, trapped in a gang where her emotional suffering is easy to dismiss. Her final claim about betrayal comes from desperation and drink, and Susan Grimshaw kills her before the truth can breathe. Arthur's journaled world, with its growing suspicion of Dutch, makes Molly's loneliness feel less like a side matter. She is one more person crushed by the dream's fate. Susan Grimshaw represents the hard discipline of camp life. She can be severe, sharp-tongued, and frightening, but she is also one of the people doing the work of keeping the gang from dissolving into filth and chaos. Arthur's journal helps us see camp as a real society, and Susan is part of that. Dutch gives speeches about freedom, but Susan makes sure people wash, work, move, and behave. The journal's attention to daily life reveals how much of the gang's survival depends on unglamorous order. Pearson gives the journal a domestic counterweight to violence. Stew, supplies, butchered meat, and camp chores may seem small, but they make the gang feel fed and embodied. Arthur's notes and drawings of animals, hunting, and provision connect naturally to Pearson's role. A robbery may keep the fantasy alive, but dinner keeps bodies alive. The journal often understands this better than Dutch's speeches do. A camp is not held together by ideals alone. It is held together by food, fire, work, and people doing tasks nobody sings about. Reverend Swanson's presence shows another kind of ruin. His addiction, guilt, faith, an eventual attempt to leave the life behind create a small mirror for Arthur. Swanson is weak in ways Arthur is not, but he also understands shame and the desire for mercy. The journal's growing spiritual weight makes Swanson more important than he first appears. He is proof that redemption in this world is uneven. Sometimes it looks like a frightened man finally stepping away from the thing destroying him. The journal records not only people, but places, and each place changes Arthur's inner weather. Horseshoe is open and almost hopeful. Clemens Point is warm, beautiful, and deceptive. Shady Bell is decayed and haunted. Lakay is damp, desperate, and broken. Beaver Hollow is dark, sick, and spiritually rotten. The journal moves with the gang through these spaces, and the notebook becomes a record of atmosphere. The camps are not interchangeable. Each one presses a different shape into Arthur's thought. Clemens Point gives the journal sunlight before the story turns darker. The lake, trees, fishing, roads, and the false gentility of the Greys and Braithwaites create a strange softness around a violent feud. Arthur's pages from this period can hold beauty and unease at once. The gang thinks it is manipulating local families, but the land is already full of old poison. The journal captures the sweetness of the place, while the plot reveals the rot underneath it. Rhodes is important because it looks civilized in a southern, polished, old family way, but its order is built on hypocrisy, racism, and generational hatred. Arthur's journaled world, attentive to buildings and local character, helps that contradict. The town has porches, stores, uniforms, and social codes, but under the surface it is as violent as anywhere. The Greys and Braithwaites are not better than outlaws because they wear cleaner clothes. They are only violence with inheritance. The Braithwaite Manor burning is one of the story's most striking images, and the journal exists near it as a private counterforce to spectacle. The gang rides through fire and revenge after Jack is taken, and for a moment their family loyalty feels righteous. But the journal's larger arc reminds us that righteous feeling does not make the life sustainable. Arthur can help burn a manor for a child, and still belong to a gang that endangers that child in the first place. The notebook has room for that uncomfortable. Jack's kidnapping also changes the emotional scale of the gang's decline. The camp's fantasy of family becomes literal when a child is taken because of adult schemes. Arthur's concern for Jack draws from his buried fatherhood, his affection for Abigail, and his growing frustration with the gang's recklessness. The journal, with its private memory and attention to children, makes this more than it is a warning. The life is no longer only killing men who chose danger. It is putting children in the path of consequences. St. Denis changes the journal because the city changes Arthur's body. The streets are crowded, smoky, modern and tight. There are factories, streetcars, electric lights, grand houses, alleys, markets and police. Arthur, a man of roads and camps, seems compressed by the city. His journal can take in the details, but the atmosphere is different. The city offers more to observe, and less. It is the future arriving in brick, metal, smoke and noise. Arthur's sketches of urban details feel especially poignant because St. Denis is the kind of world that is replacing him. He can draw it, study it, and move through it, but he cannot belong to it. The city does not need men like Dutch's gang, except as criminals to be processed, exploited, or eliminated. The journal becomes the record of a dying outlaw, looking at a modern world that has no romantic place for him. His pencil can understand the city better than his life can adapt to it. Angelo Bronte's world in St. Denis reveals another kind of criminality. Bronte wears power differently from Dutch. He has money, manners, connections, and as Arthur's journaled contrast between places helps show why Bronte matters. Crime is not disappearing with modernisation. It is becoming institutional, urban, and protected by influence. Dutch hates Bronte, partly because Bronte exposes him. The outlaw dream looks less noble when seated across from a criminal who has already learned to thrive inside civilization. The trolley station disaster and the St. Denis bank robbery break the gang's illusion of cleverness. Hosea and Lenny die. John is arrested. The gang is scattered. Arthur is shaken. The journal after this point carries absence more heavily. People who had voices in camp become memories. The pages do not need to repeat their names constantly for their absence. A notebook carried by a survivor becomes heavier after the people it once described are gone. Hosea's death is especially devastating for the journal's emotional world. Hosea was memory, craft and caution. Without him, Dutch becomes more exposed and more vulnerable to Micah's influence. Arthur loses one of the last people who could speak to Dutch with authority and one of the last elders who understood Arthur's whole life. The journal becomes, in a sense, more lonely after Hosea dies. There is less wisdom in camp, so Arthur's private observations have to carry more truth by themselves. Lenny's death is different because it is so abrupt and young. There is no grand farewell, no long speech, no time for Arthur to process it. He is simply gone on a rooftop in the chaos. The journal's earlier warmth toward Lenny makes this brutal. The notebook has helped us remember him as a person. That is one of the quiet functions of Arthur's journal. It gives lost people enough texture that their deaths feel like holes, not plot markers. Guarma is a strange interruption in Arthur's journal lore because it tears him out of the familiar map. The island is tropical, brutal, and politically charged, with sugar, exploitation, military violence, and survival under a foreign sun. Arthur is sick, exhausted, and far from the gang's usual myths. The journal's relationship to place makes Guarma feel like a fever dream in the middle of the book. It is vivid, but not home. It is a page stained by disorientation. Guarma also strips Dutch further. In the chaos there, Arthur sees more of Dutch's willingness to kill without necessity, and the journal's slow drift from loyalty to doubt accelerates, because Arthur is running out of ways to excuse what he sees. A man can ignore hints for years if the family structure depends on it. But illness, death, and exile make denial harder. The journal becomes the place where the old story Dutch told begins to lose its grammar. When Arthur returns from Guarma, the world has changed. The gang is at Lakay, broken, frightened, and hiding in swamp. The air is wet and heavy. The Pinkertons are closer. Molly is dead. John is in prison. The old warmth of Horseshoe feels impossibly far away. Arthur's journal now belongs to a man who has seen the gang nearly destroyed and still watches Dutch insist that one more plan will save them. The notebook becomes a witness to repetition disguised as hope. Lakay itself is important because it feels temporary in the worst way. Every camp is temporary, but Lakay feels like a collapse, not a pause. The swamp surrounds the gang with dampness, insects, fog and decay. It is not a place where dreams recover. It is a place where people hide while fever and suspicion spread. Arthur's journal, always sensitive to atmosphere, absorbs that heaviness. The physical world begins matching the moral state of the gang. The move to Beaver Hollow completes that descent. The cave, the darkness, the sickness, the proximity to violence and desperation, all of it makes the camp feel less like a family shelter and more like an animal den. Arthur's journal here becomes increasingly urgent and sad. The man writing is weaker, the people around him are more divided, and Dutch is less reachable than ever. The notebook, once full of wide roads and sketches of ordinary beauty, now sits near the end of a dream turning rancid. The journal's attention to Dutch in the later chapters is heartbreaking, because Arthur does not stop loving him all at once. That is part of why the story feels real. Arthur's doubt is not clean. Dutch raised him. Dutch gave him language and belonging. Dutch also uses him, lies to him, and ultimately abandons the people he claimed to love. The journal holds this contradiction like a slow bruise. It is difficult to watch someone become what part of you knows they may have always been. Micah's rise beside Dutch is one of the journal's darkest background movements. Arthur sees it, hates it, and cannot fully stop it. Micah offers Dutch a version of loyalty that requires no moral challenge, only agreement, aggression, and flattery. The journal's private honesty makes Micah's public influence feel even uglier. Arthur is learning to tell the truth inwardly, while Dutch chooses the man who lets him keep lying outwardly. That is the emotional trap of the final chapters. Arthur's expulsion of Strauss is one of the journal's most important moral turning points, even when thought of beyond the scene itself. Strauss represents a form of harm Arthur can finally name. The debt work has brought sickness, shame, and suffering into Arthur's life in a way he can no longer dismiss as business. Sending Strauss away does not undo the Downs collection, but it shows Arthur refusing to keep feeding the machine that helped make him sick. The journal's long moral record bends toward action. The Downs family returns through Edith and Archie, and Arthur's help toward them is one of the clearest examples of late repair. He cannot restore Thomas. He cannot unbeat a dying man. He cannot give them the years his actions helped ruin. What he can do is help them leave a worse fate, give money, and use what strength remains to reduce harm instead of causing it. The journal becomes more than confession here. It is the private background of a man trying to turn remorse into something useful. Sister Calderon, when Arthur encounters her, gives voice to the fear the journal has been circling. Arthur admits that he is afraid. That admission matters, because Arthur rarely allows himself that kind of naked truth. The journal has prepared us for it. We already know he is reflective, guilty, observant, and tired. Hearing him say fear out loud feels less like a sudden revelation, and more like the private pages finally reaching speech. The notebook and the confession meet in the same wounded honesty. Reverend Swanson can serve a similar role depending on the path, offering another kind of farewell conversation. Whether the station scene belongs to Sister Calderon or Swanson, the emotional point remains. Arthur's private struggle becomes spoken. The journal has carried the long interior road. The conversation lets another person briefly stand beside it. Arthur is not saved by being told he is good. He is steadied by being seen as someone still capable of choosing better before the end. The repeated image of trains around Arthur's story also belongs near the journal. Trains are movement, industry, escape, and fate. The gang robs them, rides them, flees them, and watches modern life rush along rails that outlast any outlaw dream. Arthur's journal records a world where trains cut through wilderness and connect towns, but they also symbolise the century arriving on schedule. Arthur can ride alongside a train, jump onto it, rob it, or escape by it. He cannot stop what it represents. The journal's sketches of technology and towns show that Arthur is living at the edge of transformation. Cameras, electric lights, streetcars, factories, telegraphs, and railroads all belong to the world closing around him. Arthur does not write like a historian giving a lecture, but his pages feel historical because he notices change without always naming. The old life is ending in details: wires overhead, smoke over buildings, law arriving faster, money moving through banks, and the wild roads becoming mapped. This makes Arthur's journal a record of the vanishing frontier as much as a record of one man. He draws landscapes that will be fenced, towns that will grow, animals that will be hunted, camps that will disappear, and people whose kind of freedom is becoming impossible. Red Dead Redemption 2 is set at a time when the West is being absorbed into systems, law, capital, transport, industry, and memory. Arthur's notebook is not official history. It is the field journal of a man being erased by history. The word law fits Arthur's journal because the book does not only tell us plot, it tells us how the world feels to him. Law is not just events and names, it is the way the story teaches a place to have memory. Arthur's journal gives memory a texture, pencil lines, cross thoughts, rough humour, animal sketches, place names, and private regret. It is one of the reasons Red Dead Redemption 2 feels less like a sequence of missions and more like a life that was lived moment by moment. The journal is also one of the gentlest ways the story handles Arthur's intelligence. He is not educated in a formal way like some men might be, and he often speaks as if he considers himself simple or brutish, but the journal contradicts that self-image. Arthur is perceptive, expressive, visually talented, emotionally aware, and capable of irony. He may not use polished language to describe himself, but the book proves he is thinking. His tragedy is partly that he underestimates the very soul the journal reveals. Arthur's self-mockery appears in the journal as a defence against hope. When he writes about himself, he can be hard, dismissive, and ashamed. He often seems more comfortable identifying his flaws than accepting his virtues. This is psychologically important. A man who believes he is already bad has less reason to demand better treatment from himself or others. Dutch benefits from Arthur's low. A son who thinks he is only useful as a weapon will keep letting the father load and aim him. The journal slowly challenges that self-image, not by giving Arthur a sudden heroic ego, but by preserving evidence that he was never only what he feared. A cruel man does not draw the world with such tenderness without conflict inside him. A stupid man does not understand people with such weary accuracy. A heartless man does not become so wounded by the suffering he caused. The journal does not flatter Arthur, it simply refuses to let his worst acts be the only evidence admitted. Arthur's handwriting and drawings also give the story a feeling of physical intimacy. We are not only told he kept a journal, we see the marks, we see the unevenness, the style, the personality in line and phrase. This matters because Red Dead Redemption 2 is obsessed with material detail. Mud on boots, oil on guns, hair growth, horse sweat, camp chores, letters, photographs, and worn clothing. The journal belongs to that same world of touch. It is not an abstract menu, it is a thing a dying man held. Photographs and letters sit emotionally beside the journal. Arthur keeps pieces of his past with him, family traces, old love, evidence of people gone. The journal becomes the place where new memories join those older relics. In a life without a permanent home, portable memory matters. A man who cannot keep a house keeps a satchel. A man who cannot keep a family keeps letters. A man who cannot keep peace keeps pages. Arthur's whole private life is carried because nothing around him stays. Dutch's speeches are public writing without paper. They are stories composed aloud, shaping the gang's reality. Arthur's journal is the opposite private writing that slowly strips stories down. Dutch uses language to enlarge himself. Arthur uses writing, especially later, to face what is happening. This contrast is one of the deepest parts of the game's emotional design. The false prophet speaks by firelight. The dying witness writes in a notebook. One voice gathers followers, the other voice. Hosea's absence after St. Denis makes this contrast even sharper. Hosea might have read the world with the same clear eye Arthur is developing, but he is gone before the final collapse. Without Hosea, Arthur's journal becomes one of the last places where the gang's reality is described with sanity. Dutch still talks about faith. Micah talks about strength. Arthur writes from the book becomes a quiet court where the dream is finally judged by what it has done to people. Arthur's relationship with faith is complicated, and the journal helps hold that complication. He is not a conventionally religious man, but he is not spiritually empty. He thinks about goodness, damnation, fear, and whether change matters when a life has been. His conversations with religious figures matter because they meet a need already present in the journal. Arthur does not need theology as decoration. He needs a way to understand whether a bad man can still choose a better ending. The deer and wolf imagery tied to honour belongs beside the journal's moral atmosphere. The visions are not journal entries in a literal notebook sense, but they work like symbolic illustrations of Arthur's inner direction. The deer suggests grace, stillness, and mercy. The wolf suggests hunger, loneliness, and predation. These images are powerful because Arthur's journal already taught us to read animals as meaningful presences. Nature becomes a mirror, not through heavy explanation, but through repeated attention. In the high honour path, the deer feels like the world answering the gentler part of Arthur that the journal has shown all along. He has drawn animals, noticed landscape, helped people, confessed fear, and tried to use his last strength differently. The deer does not erase the violence. It simply lets the final image lean toward peace. It feels earned, because the journal has spent the whole story proving Arthur was capable of seeing the world softly. In the low honour path, the wolf carries a colder truth. It reflects a life that remained closer to appetite, anger and violence. Yet even that image is not empty spectacle. Wolves in Arthur's world are animals of survival, danger, hunger and pack life. The journal's natural eye gives the symbol weight. Arthur's end, whichever shape it takes, is tied back to the way he saw the world around him. The final animal is not random. It belongs to his private language. One of the quietest tragedies is that Arthur may have had the temperament of an artist, but the upbringing of a weapon. His journal reveals the artist. His life reveals the weapon. Dutch and Hosea found him young, poor, angry and alone, then shaped him for survival inside their outlaw family. That family gave him love, but it also gave his talents almost no safe direction. The journal becomes evidence of a self that never had the right conditions to grow freely. Arthur's sketches of strangers are important for the same reason. He does not only draw gang members or mission targets, he draws people he meets, people passing through the world, people with odd stories, people in distress, people outside the gang's central drama. That expands his moral universe. Dutch's worldview tends to divide people into us: enemies, fools and obstacles. Arthur's journal keeps discovering individuals. The more individuals he sees, the harder Dutch's simplified story becomes to believe. The stranger missions deepen the journal because they give Arthur experiences outside the gang's plans. He meets inventors, artists, widows, veterans, religious figures, scientists, and lost people of many kinds. Some are comic, some are tragic, some are strange enough to feel almost dreamlike. The journal records these meetings as part of Arthur's personal world, not Dutch's strategy. Every side encounter quietly proves that life is larger than the gang's desperation. Albert Mason, the wildlife photographer, is one of the best examples. His work with animals is clumsy, sincere and funny, and Arthur's assistance shows a different kind of partnership with the natural world. Arthur helps not because the gang profits, but because the man is harmless and passionate. The journal's drawings of animals make this connection feel natural. Arthur may tease Albert, but he understands the impulse to capture beauty before it moves away. Charlotte Balfour, the widow Arthur can help survive in the wilderness, is another powerful journal-adjacent figure. She is grieving, alone, and unprepared for the harshness around her. Arthur teaches her practical skills with a gentleness that can feel startling if only his outlaw side is remembered. This encounter matters because he gives knowledge instead of taking money. He helps someone live after loss. The journal has shown his attention to the land, and with Charlotte, that attention becomes a gift. Hamish Sinclair gives Arthur another late friendship outside the gang. A veteran living with injury and memory, Hamish meets Arthur through fishing and hunting rather than crime. Their bond is calm, masculine in a gentler register, built on shared outdoor skill and mutual respect. In journal terms, Hamish belongs to the world Arthur might have chosen if he had aged into solitude rather than gang collapse. Fishing, stories, a cabin, a horse, a quiet friendship. All of it feels like a possible life glimpsed too late. The veteran's horse, Buell, can become one of the most emotionally charged details in Arthur's later life. If Arthur keeps Buell, the horse carries Hamish's memory into the final stretch. This is exactly the kind of thing Arthur's journal teaches us to value, a practical object or animal becoming heavy with story. Buell is not only transportation, he is friendship, loss, trust, and inheritance. The journal's world is full of such transformations, where ordinary things become memory because someone cared. The widow, the veteran, the photographer, and many other strangers matter, because Arthur's journal frames him as someone who can exist outside Dutch's moral economy. With Dutch, actions must serve the plan, the gang, survival, or the dream. With strangers, Arthur often acts from curiosity, sympathy, irritation, amusement, or simple decency. The journal absorbs those experiences and helps Arthur become less dependent on Dutch's explanation of what his life means. The scientist Marco Dragic and the strange artificial creation he pursues show another side of the world Arthur records: modernity as wonder and danger. Electric experiments, machines, and impossible ambition belong to the same changing century as streetcars and industrial cities. Arthur may not fully understand all of it, but the journal can hold his reaction. The world is becoming stranger, not only more lawful. The future is not clean. It is brilliant, foolish, eerie, and lonely. The artist Charles Chattenay gives Arthur contact with another kind of outsider, ridiculous, selfish, talented, and impossible to categorise. Arthur's tolerance for strange people is part of his hidden softness. He may complain, but he keeps getting pulled into lives unlike his own. The journal preserves these odd meetings because they show Arthur as more than a man moving from one robbery to the next. He becomes a witness to the margins of a changing world. The electric chair story with Professor Bell and the condemned man exposes Arthur to spectacle disguised as progress. Modern society claims to be more civilized than outlaws, yet it turns death into demonstration, law into theatre, and invention into cruelty. Arthur's journaled world is perfect for this contradiction. He is guilty of violence, but he is not wrong to notice that civilization has its own appetite for blood. The book becomes a place where hypocrisy can be quietly seen. The Aberdeen pig farm, if encountered, is one of the darkest stranger episodes because hospitality becomes predation. Arthur's journal exists in a world where danger can wear a smile, a dinner table, or a family story. This matters because Dutch's gang also uses friendliness, charm, and performance when it wants something. The difference between criminal outsiders and respectable monsters becomes blurrier the more Arthur sees. The notebook collects these uncomfortable lessons. The serial killer clues and other hidden horrors of the world add another layer to the journal's atmosphere. Arthur may be violent, but he moves through a world where violence has many forms, some far more senseless and intimate than outlaw robbery. The journal's drawings and notes can include these strange discoveries, making the world feel haunted beyond the main story. Evil is not located only in enemy gangs. It is scattered in cabins, cellars, letters and landscapes. The supernatural hints and mysteries around the map also fit the journal, because Arthur is a rational, practical man living in a world that sometimes refuses to be ordinary. Ghost stories, strange figures, unexplained sounds, old rituals and eerie places can all brush against the notebook. Arthur may not become a believer in every tale, but he records what he sees. That restraint makes the mystery stronger. The book can leave some things unsolved. Sometimes it simply leaves a mark where the world became strange. Arthur's handwriting after the illness seems emotionally heavier, because every page becomes an act of remaining. The body is failing, the breath is shorter, the cough is worse, the face in mirrors changes, but the pencil still moves. That is powerful, because writing is one of the few forms of control left to him. Dutch controls the plan. The Pinkertons control the pressure. Disease controls the body. The journal gives Arthur a small place where he can still order experience honestly. Mirrors are worth thinking about beside the journal. When Arthur looks at himself, especially later, the face looking back is not the strong enforcer everyone expects. It is a sick man, aging quickly, carrying visible consequence. The journal is another mirror, but one that reflects more than the body. It reflects attention, guilt, love, anger, denial, and change. The bathroom mirror shows what tuberculosis is doing to Arthur's appearance. The journal shows what truth is doing to his soul. Arthur's final chapters are not only about becoming good, they are about becoming honest. The journal supports that distinction. A simple redemption story might pretend Arthur discovers morality from nowhere, but the notebook shows he has always noticed enough to be troubled. What changes is his willingness to act from that trouble. The journal is therefore not the cause of redemption, but the evidence that redemption had roots. The roots were buried deep under loyalty, shame, and habit. Dutch's plan to leave John behind after the train robbery becomes one of the final breaks. Arthur can no longer reconcile Dutch's words about family with his choices. The journal has been tracking this collapse for a long time. By then, Dutch's speeches sound like smoke compared with the evidence Arthur has gathered in his own life. Jack endangered, John abandoned, Abigail dismissed, Hosea dead, Lenny dead, Molly dead, Kieran dead. Loyalty rewarded only when it obeys. The notebook knows what Dutch refuses to know. Arthur giving his satchel and journal to John is one of the most important symbolic acts in the story. He gives John practical supplies, yes, but the journal is more than a tool. It is Arthur's private witness, his memory, his art, his shame, his observations, and the record of how he came to understand the gang's collapse. By passing it on, Arthur gives John not only but a chance to remember correctly. The book becomes part of what Arthur saves. This handoff is beautiful because Arthur does not write a grand public confession and ask the world to forgive him. He gives his pages to a man who needs to leave. That is quieter and truer. Arthur's redemption is not about controlling his legacy. It is about using what is left to push someone else. The journal's survival is almost accidental, and that makes it feel more intimate. It is not a monument. It is a worn book carried out of disaster. John inheriting the journal changes the meaning of the epilogue. The book does not end when Arthur dies. It continues, but differently. John's handwriting and drawings are rougher, less elegant, and filled with his own perspective. That difference is important. The journal is not magically Arthur's voice forever. It becomes a shared object, marked by another man trying to build a life from what Arthur preserved. The pages carry continuity without pretending John and Arthur are the same. John's use of the journal is touching because he is not naturally the same kind of observer Arthur was. John is more blunt, less artistic, less inwardly graceful with words and sketches. Yet he writes anyway. He continues the habit because the book has become part of the life he inherited. That makes the epilogue feel like an act of awkward devotion. John may not be able to draw like Arthur, but he can carry the book. He can keep going. The journal in John's hands also changes how Beecher's hope feels. Arthur never gets the home. John tries to build one. The book that travelled through camp collapses, robberies, illness and death ends up near fences, lumber, Abigail, Jack, Uncle, and a fragile attempt at domestic life. That movement is the entire emotional promise Arthur died for. The journal moves from outlaw wandering into the possibility of a settled table. It does not make the future safe, but it makes the attempt visible. John reading or carrying Arthur's journal means Arthur remains present in the epilogue without needing to appear as a ghost. It sits in the satchel, in the pages, in John's decisions, in the life John tries to build. This is one reason the journal is such elegant storytelling. It lets Arthur haunt the remaining story quietly, not with supernatural drama, but with handwriting. A dead man's attention continues inside the living man's hands. The epilogue drawings also make the journal a study. Arthur's pages are careful, observant, and often beautiful. John's are more limited, but they are sincere. The difference tells a story about what can and cannot be passed down. Arthur can give John the book, the memory, the chance, and the warning. He cannot give John his exact soul. John must write awkwardly in his own hand. That is what survival means. It continues the line, but not perfectly. The journal's presence in the epilogue also makes Red Dead Redemption 1 feel heavier in retrospect. John eventually cannot escape the past forever. The government finds him. His attempt at a family life becomes another story of violence, coercion, and sacrifice. Arthur's journal then becomes part of a chain of doomed hopes. He saves John for a time, and that time matters, even if it does not last forever. The book is not proof that redemption defeats history. It is proof that time given to love is still worth giving. Arthur's final ride, when understood through the journal, feels like the closing of a notebook as much as the end of a body. The song, the memories, the faces, the roads, the choices, and the light all gather around a man whose private pages have been teaching us how to read him. The ride is not powerful only because Arthur is dying. It is powerful because we have seen what he noticed, what he regretted, what he loved, and what he could not say. The journal makes the final ride feel earned from the inside. The mountain ending, especially in the high honour path, gives Arthur a final landscape that feels like one of his drawings become dawn, rock, sky, breath, and distance surround him. He is no longer writing, but the world is composed the way his journal often composed it, a man small against nature, life continuing beyond him, beauty present without needing to save him. Arthur dies facing a view, and that matters because he was always a man who looked. His last gift is action, his last comfort. In the lower honour endings, the journal's tragedy cuts differently. The world does not soften in the same way. The private pages still exist, but the final direction is harsher, more lonely, more consumed by violence. This does not make the journal meaningless. It makes it sadder. The notebook recorded possibility, but possibility was not fully chosen. That is why the journal can carry multiple Arthurs. It is intimate enough to reflect the life lived, not only the ending preferred. The journal's beauty is that it never asks for Arthur to be simplified. It does not turn him into a saint. It does not excuse what he has done. It does not pretend drawing birds' balances, beating a sick man. Instead, it gives the full discomfort of a human being, cruel and tender, loyal and blind, observant and self-deceiving, frightening and gentle, late to change and still capable of change. That complexity is the heart of Arthur Morgan's law. The journal is where the complexity is easiest to touch. There is also a quiet class story inside the journal. Arthur is not a rich man, not a scholar, not an officially important historical figure. He is a poor outlaw whose life would, in the larger world, likely be recorded only by wanted posters, law reports and rumours. The journal gives him a record in his own hand. That matters deeply. History would call him criminal and move on. The notebook says he was also someone who saw, thought, loved, feared and changed. Wanted posters reduce people to names, crimes and prices. Arthur's journal expands people back into weather, voices, jokes, drawings and regret. That contrast is one of the quietest political meanings of the book. The law wants a simplified Arthur because simplified men are easier to hang, chase or file away. Dutch wants a useful Arthur because useful sons are easier to command. The journal gives us an unfiled Arthur, a man no institution fully owns. Even the act of drawing a town or animal can be read as resistance against being reduced to violence. Arthur does not know he is resisting in that way. He is not making an artistic manifesto. But every careful sketch says there is more happening inside him than the world expects. A society that sees him only as an outlaw would not imagine him patiently drawing the delicate lines of a bird. The journal quietly proves that human beings exceed their categories, even when their sins remain real. Arthur's spelling, phrasing and roughness are part of the charm, because the journal does not sound like a polished literary artifact. It sounds like him. That matters for authenticity. A too perfect notebook would feel false. Arthur's pages are thoughtful but not pretentious, emotional but often guarded, observant but grounded. The language belongs to a man who has lived outdoors, fought hard and learned through experience more than books. The beauty comes from sincerity, not polish. The journal also helps explain why Arthur can feel so alive even outside cutscenes. It creates a private continuity between events. A mission happens, a stranger is met, a place is discovered, and the journal absorbs it into Arthur's ongoing life. Without the notebook, those events might feel more separate. With it, they become memories. The book stitches the wandering together. It gives Arthur a self that travels through everything, instead of resetting from scene to scene. The journal's maps and location notes give the world a personal geography. Official maps show roads, rivers, towns and borders. Arthur's journal turns geography into experience. A place is not only where it is what happened there, what was drawn there, what was felt there, what was lost there. The West becomes layered with personal marks. A lake can mean fishing with a boy. A mountain can mean a rescue. A city can mean death. A road can mean the last chance to change. The small sketches of people can be especially moving, because Arthur is not always good at saying he cares. A drawn face can hold a kind of affection he might never speak. It is safer to sketch than to confess, safer to notice than to say, I love you, I am afraid, I do not know what I am without this family. The journal becomes the emotional language Arthur can manage. Its restraint is what makes it powerful. Arthur's relationship to beauty is complicated by shame. He sees beauty constantly, but he does not seem to think beauty belongs to him. He can draw a landscape, but he does not imagine retiring into it. He can help a widow, but he does not imagine he deserves peace. He can love Mary, but he cannot imagine himself clean enough to stay. The journal is full of beauty observed from a man standing outside the possibility of receiving it. That distance gives the pages their ache. This ache grows stronger after the diagnosis, because Arthur's ability to see beauty becomes almost unbearable. The world has always been beautiful, but now the beauty is leaving him. A sunset, a horse, a conversation, a patch of woods, the sound of camp settling at night, all of it becomes temporary in a sharper way. The writing does not have to become poetic on purpose. Mortality makes ordinary description feel poetic. The pencil is writing against disappearance. The journal also reveals how much Arthur values honesty when he finally recognises it. He has lived among lies for years. Dutch's noble lies, the gang's survival lies, the lies outlaws tell themselves about who deserves harm, the lies men tell to keep from admitting fear. In the journal, Arthur can be more honest than he is in conversation, because paper does not interrupt or demand performance. Late in the story, that honesty becomes one of his last forms of freedom. Freedom in Arthur's journal is different from Dutch's freedom. Dutch speaks of freedom as escape from government, law, banks, civilization and control. Arthur's journal slowly discovers freedom as the ability to see clearly and choose decently, even with little time left. Dutch's freedom keeps requiring more money and more blood. Arthur's freedom becomes smaller but truer. Help John, help Abigail, help Jack, stop Strauss, aid the Downs family, tell the truth, face the end. The journal records the shrinking of fantasy into morality. The journal's silence after Arthur's death is as important as its words before. There is no final entry from Arthur explaining everything neatly. Death interrupts. The book continues only because John survives. That interruption feels honest. People do not always get to summarise themselves. Sometimes a life ends with pages unfinished, with thoughts unwritten, with drawings that never happen. Arthur's absence is felt in the space where his hand no longer moves. John's continuation does not fill that absence. It surrounds it. When John writes, the reader can feel both the new presence and the missing one. The same book now carries two lives, but the difference between them remains visible. This is how grief often works. The living continue using objects the dead once touched. A coat, a photograph, a tool, a notebook. The object changes because the hand has changed, but memory remains inside the material. The journal as an inherited object also connects Arthur to Jack. Jack is the child Arthur helps save, and later Jack becomes the one who carries the Marston story beyond John. Even if Jack is not the primary writer of Arthur's journal, the book belongs to the chain of choices that let him grow older. Arthur's pages are part of the road that leads to Jack having any future at all. The child fishing by the river becomes the living proof that Arthur's late choices mattered. There is something deeply fitting about Arthur leaving behind drawings rather than treasure. The Blackwater money, Dutch's plans, the scores, the robberies, the gold, all of that becomes poisonous or unreachable. The journal remains. A gang obsessed with one final fortune produces, from its most loyal enforcer, a book of observations. That is almost the whole story in miniature. The money everyone chased could not save them. The thing Arthur made quietly is what survives with tenderness. The journal also changes how we think about the title Red Dead Redemption. Redemption is not only a final act, it is a process of seeing. Arthur must see Dutch clearly, see himself clearly, see John and Abigail's need clearly, see the harm done to the Downs family clearly, and see that time is short. The journal has been training that sight from the beginning. He was always looking. Redemption begins when looking becomes honesty, and honesty becomes action. Arthur's pencil lines become a kind of moral preparation. To draw something, he must stop and pay attention. To pay attention, he must admit that the world outside his immediate need has value. That is the opposite of predation. Predation sees only use. Attention sees presence. Arthur remains a predator in many parts of his life, but the journal proves another capacity existed beside it. In the end, that capacity helps him choose people over plans. The journal's emotional power also comes from the fact that Arthur never seems to expect anyone to admire it. He is not performing sensitivity for strangers. The book feels private, sometimes almost secret. That privacy makes it more trustworthy. The best parts of Arthur are not a sales pitch. They are habits. He draws because he draws. He notices because he notices. He writes because something in him needs to put the passing world somewhere it can remain. That private habit makes the discovery of the journal feel, or reading it, feels like being allowed near Arthur's unguarded mind. This is why the book must be handled gently in any telling of his lore. It is not a gimmick. It is not just a collectible menu. It is the place where Arthur Morgan, who spends so much of life being useful to others, finally exists for himself. The pages are where he is not only son, soldier, debtor's fist, big brother, or dying man. He is a witness. The idea of witness is central. Arthur witnesses the end of the outlaw age, the collapse of Dutch's charisma, the deaths of friends, the suffering of strangers, the cruelty of law and criminality alike, the beauty of nature, and the narrowing of his own breath. The journal gathers that witnessing. It gives the story a second memory, quieter than cutscenes, and deeper than. Arthur may not survive, but his witness does. Because Arthur is a witness, the journal also makes the world feel less disposable. Places do not vanish when the plot leaves them, they stay in the book. Animals do not vanish after being hunted, they become sketches. Strangers do not vanish after a mission ends, they become notes. This is one reason Red Dead Redemption 2 feels so unusually mournful. The world is not only interacted with, it is remembered. And memory, once created, makes loss heavier. Arthur's journal also teaches pacing. It invites slowness. A person can rush through the story and still finish it, but the journal rewards pausing. It asks for looking, reading, noticing changes, and letting small experiences accumulate. That rhythm suits Arthur's arc perfectly. His transformation is not believable as a sudden turn. It is believable as accumulation. One page, one doubt, one kindness, one death, one cough, one memory, one final decision. The journal is therefore a structure of accumulation. Every entry adds a little weight. No single drawing explains Arthur. No single sentence redeems him. But together, the pages make a soul visible. This is how real change often feels. Not like lightning, but like sediment. Experiences settle, regrets settle, faces settle. Eventually the ground inside a person is different, and a choice that once seemed impossible becomes necessary. Arthur's journal is also tied to shame, and shame is one of the most important parts of his law. He knows, earlier than he admits, that much of his life is wrong. But shame can trap as easily as awaken. If a man believes he is damned, he may keep acting damned, because change feels like hypocrisy. The journal lets Arthur move through shame slowly. It gives him a place to admit ugliness, without being frozen by it. That is part of why his late kindnesses feel human, rather than simple. Regret in the journal is not clean either. Arthur regrets some things deeply, and still cannot undo them. He regrets hurting people, and still has to live inside the gang's consequences. He regrets Mary, and still cannot become the man she needed. He regrets John being foolish, and still spends years resenting him before saving him. The journal's power is that it does not turn regrets. Regret hurts because the past remains. Redemption matters because the future, however short, is still open. The Downes family is the clearest example. Arthur cannot make the original harm vanish. The journal cannot rewrite the scene at the ranch. But later action can change what happens next. That is the moral centre of the book. A page may hold guilt, but guilt must eventually walk outside the page. Arthur's final goodness is not only emotional, it is practical. He uses money, strength, and risk to redirect lives where he once damaged them. Arthur's late help for John is similar. He cannot give John a perfect future. He cannot cure the danger following the Marstons. He cannot remove John's past or guarantee Abigail's happiness. What he can do is buy time and place his remaining loyalty where it belongs. The journal prepares this by slowly moving Arthur's concern from Dutch's dream to real people. The dream gets smaller, the love gets clearer. That is why the journal's final emotional direction is not abstract redemption, but chosen responsibility. Arthur stops asking whether Dutch's plan will save everyone, and starts asking who. John needs to leave, Abigail needs help, Jack needs a father, the Downes family needs a way out, Strauss's debtors need Arthur to stop. The journal's private moral education becomes public through these decisions. The man who once recorded harm becomes the man trying to reduce it. The journal also helps explain why Arthur's death feels peaceful in the high honour ending, despite everything terrible. Peace does not come because he solved the world. It comes because his final actions align with the private truth the journal has been uncovering. He is still guilty. He is still dying. Dutch still fails him. Micah still destroys. But Arthur has finally stopped lying to himself about what matters. The sunrise is not forgiveness from the universe. It is clarity. Clarity is one of the journal's deepest gifts. Early Arthur sees details, but not the whole. Later Arthur sees patterns, Dutch's decay, Micah's poison, John's chance, his own sickness, the cost of cruelty, the emptiness of one more score. The journal shows how perception matures. At first, he observes the world. Then, he begins to interpret it. Finally, he acts on what he understands. The book is not only a record of what Arthur saw, it is the story of learning how to see. The journal's artistic side makes that learning even more moving. Drawing is an act of selection. Arthur chooses what to preserve. He cannot draw everything. He cannot write everything. The book is full of what caught him: a building, a creature, a face, a strange event, a place he might never return to. These choices reveal his soul in fragments. What a person notices is often as revealing as what they say. Arthur notices vulnerability more and more as the story goes on. He notices sick people, frightened people, lonely people, people trapped by systems, people pretending to be stronger than they are. This growing attention changes him. Earlier, vulnerability was often something his work. Later, vulnerability becomes something he wants to protect. The journal records the difference between seeing weakness as opportunity and seeing it as a call for mercy. Mercy is not natural to the gang's survival logic. Dutch can talk about helping the poor, but the gang often harms poor people when convenient. Arthur's journal slowly exposes the gap between philosophy and behaviour. True mercy, when Arthur finally practices it, is not glamorous. It is giving money, escorting someone, refusing a debt, helping a widow, getting a family out, telling John to run. The journal's beauty is that it makes these small mercies feel larger than any robbery. The journal's relationship to money is quietly important. So much of the gang's life revolves around money, needing it, stealing it, losing it, dreaming of the final amount that will free them. Arthur's journal, by contrast, is full of things money cannot properly measure. A sketch of a deer, a note about a friend, a memory of Mary, a fear of death, a beautiful view, a guilty thought. The book becomes evidence that the richest parts of Arthur's life were not the things Dutch. This does not mean Arthur is above money. He robs, loots, collects, buys, sells, upgrades and contributes. He lives inside the economy of outlaw survival. But the journal lets another value system exist in parallel. It values memory, detail, honesty and beauty. The tragedy of the gang is that Dutch's dream keeps confusing money with freedom. Arthur's journal slowly remembers that freedom might be closer to truth than wealth. Truth is hard for Arthur because loyalty trained him to distrust his own doubts. When he sees Dutch make a cruel choice, part of him wants to explain it away. When Micah grows more powerful, part of him expects Dutch to correct the imbalance. When the gang suffers, part of him still hopes the old family can return. The journal catches him in that painful middle state. It is the record of a man whose instincts are becoming wiser than his beliefs. Belief is one of Dutch's strongest tools. He does not only lead through orders, he leads through meaning. He tells the gang what their suffering means, what their enemies mean, what their crimes mean, what their future means. Arthur's journal becomes dangerous to Dutch's influence because it records details that resist the story. Dead friends resist the story. Sick debtors resist the story. Abandoned sons resist the story. A notebook full of evidence can quietly defeat a speech. The book also lets Arthur have a relationship with time. Dutch always talks about the next move, the future place, the final score, the plan just beyond reach. Arthur's journal keeps returning to the present and the past. What happened, what was seen, what hurt, what changed. After the diagnosis, time becomes even more specific. There may not be another distant paradise. There is only the next page, the next ride, the next choice. The journal grounds Arthur in time Dutch keeps trying to outrun. This grounding makes the final chapters in Arthur stops living for the fantasy of Tahiti or Australia or some untouched place where consequences cannot follow. He begins living for immediate, embodied tasks. Get Abigail out. Get John out. Help who can still be helped. Face Micah. Confront Dutch. The journal, as a grounded object, fits that shift perfectly. It is made of pages, not promises. It belongs. The journal is also where Arthur's loneliness becomes most visible. He is surrounded by people for most of the story, yet privately alone with many of his deepest thoughts. He cannot fully tell Dutch what he sees. He cannot fully tell John why he is angry until late. He cannot fully tell Mary how trapped he feels. He cannot fully tell the camp how afraid he is. The journal receives what other relationships cannot. It is the companion that does not answer back. That loneliness makes the handoff to John more meaningful. Arthur's private companion becomes shared. The book that held his unsaid thoughts enters another life. In a way, Arthur is finally letting someone carry the part of him he rarely showed. John may not understand every page perfectly, but he carries it. That is enough. A man who struggled to speak leaves behind something more honest than many speeches. The journal's survival also says something about memory in violent lives. Guns are lost, camps are abandoned, money disappears, bodies are buried, and names become rumours. A notebook can survive almost by chance. Yet that fragile survival is what lets Arthur's inner life remain. The object is vulnerable. Paper can burn, tear, soak, or be thrown away. Its survival feels miraculous precisely because it is not built like a weapon. The softest object outlasts many harder ones. There is a beautiful irony in that. Arthur's revolvers make him feared, but his journal makes him known. Fear travels quickly, but it flattens a person. Knowledge takes longer and asks more patience. By the end, what matters most to us is not only that Arthur could shoot, fight, or endure pain. It is that he could look at a flower, draw a horse, regret a cruelty, love a child, distrust a lie, and finally choose another person's future over his own survival. The journal is not separate from the rest of Red Dead Redemption 2's design. It belongs with camp conversations, random encounters, wildlife, weather, letters, photographs, grave sites, songs, and environmental detail. The whole game is built around accumulation of small truths. Arthur's journal is the most personal form of that design. It gathers the world in miniature, one page at a time, until the ending feels less like a plot twist and more like the graves, when visited later, echo the journal's purpose. A grave is a public mark of someone gone. The journal is a private mark of someone who noticed the gone while still alive. Together they create the story's mourning structure. The graves tell us where bodies rest. The journal tells us how those lives move through Arthur's mind. Death in Red Dead Redemption 2 is powerful because the world keeps marks, letters, memories, scars, and pages. Arthur's own grave completes the circle. The man who recorded others becomes someone others can visit if they know where to go. His grave changes depending on honour, giving even the resting place a moral atmosphere. But the journal means Arthur is not contained only by the grave. His body rests in one place. His influence moves through John, Abigail, Jack, and the life they attempt to build. Death stops Arthur's hand, not the meaning of what he wrote. The journal's connection to John also carries a quiet warning. John has Arthur's memory, but memory alone cannot save him from every future mistake. He still hunts Micah with Seddy and Charles. He still draws attention. He still builds a life under a name that can be found. He still becomes the man the government will later use. Arthur's journal gives him wisdom, but wisdom inherited is not the same as wisdom fully obeyed. That makes the epilogue bittersweet rather than simple. Still, the attempt matters. John building Beecher's hope with Arthur's journal in the world feels like a reply to Arthur's final wish. The fences, house, barn, marriage and family routines are not glamorous, but they are exactly the kind of ordinary permanence Arthur never secured. The journal has spent the story drawing other people's houses and temporary camps. In the epilogue, the book comes near a home that someone is actually trying to keep. The journal, therefore, becomes one of the game's strongest symbols of continuity. Arthur is gone, but the world does not reset. John writes, Jack grows, Abigail hopes, Sadie moves on in her own restless way. Charles seeks another place. The old gang is broken, but not every person is destroyed immediately. The notebook helps carry that continuity because it is literally the same object moving from one chapter of life to another. When thinking of Arthur Morgan's journal lore, it helps to remember that the book is both authored by Arthur and shaped by the life around him. It is not pure self-expression in isolation. The world pushes into it. Weather pushes into it. People push into it. Violence pushes into it. Beauty pushes into it. Sickness pushes into it. That is why it feels so alive. It is a self-portrait made by drawing everything except, often, the self directly. Arthur's self-portrait emerges indirectly. He draws animals, and we see his patience. He writes regret, and we see his conscience. He mocks foolishness, and we see his humour. He notes Dutch's behaviour, and we see his doubt. He remembers Mary, and we see longing. He helps John, and we see love. The journal rarely needs Arthur to say, "This is who I am." It lets who he is appear through what he cannot stop noticing. The journal also deepens the theme of masculinity in Arthur's story. Arthur lives in a world where men are expected to be hard, violent, unemotional, useful, and loyal to other men. His journal quietly breaks that code without making a speech about it. Drawing, confessing fear, noticing beauty, recording tenderness, and admitting guilt are all forms of vulnerability. Arthur may still speak roughly, but the book reveals a man whose inner life is far wider than the masculine role he performs. This hidden vulnerability makes his bond with John, Charles, Hosea, Lenny, and even Dutch more painful. Arthur wants connection, but often cannot speak it clean. He respects Charles, loves Hosea, cares for John, admires parts of Lenny, and remains tied to Dutch long after trust is damaged. The journal is where those tangled attachments leave shadows. It is not an open love letter to the gang, but it is full of evidence that Arthur's heart was never as hard as his reputation. The journal's camp entries also reveal how families can be both real and harmful. The Van der Linde gang is not fake simply because it becomes destructive. People did love each other. They raised children, fed one another, sang together, mourned together, and risked themselves for one another. The journal preserves that reality. But love inside a harmful structure can still lead people toward ruin. Arthur's pages are painful because they show the family was real and still not enough to save itself. That is one reason Dutch's betrayal hurt so much. If the gang had only been a lie, Arthur's awakening would be simpler. But the journal remembers laughter, kindness, loyalty, and shared hardship. Dutch did give Arthur a home of sorts. Hosea did help raise him. The camp did hold warmth. The betrayal is not that none of it mattered. The betrayal is that Dutch sacrifices what mattered to protect his own myth. Arthur's journal is where the old warmth and final disgust can both remain true. Micah's presence in that family shows how corruption often enters through permission. Micah does not create every flaw in Dutch or the gang. He encourages what is already dangerous: pride, violence, contempt, paranoia, and the fantasy that strength proves truth. Arthur's journaled suspicion of Micah feels sane because the book is rooted in observation. Arthur watches what Micah does to rooms, to conversations, to Dutch. He sees the change in atmosphere before the full betrayal is known. Observation is Arthur's great underrated power. He is strong, but strength alone would make him less memorable. He is loyal, but loyalty alone would make him tragic in a simpler way. He observes. He notices the person behind the role, the landscape behind the route, the lie behind the speech, the sorrow behind the anger. The journal is the evidence of that power. It is not a power that saves him from death, but it helps him make his death mean something. Arthur's journal is therefore not just an optional collectible detail. It is one of the central emotional Without it, Arthur is still a great character. With it, he becomes almost unbearably human. The journal gives him time when the story is rushing, privacy when the gang is loud, tenderness when violence dominates, and self-awareness when denial is easier. It turns an outlaw story into a study of a soul learning to read itself. The book also changes how silence works. Arthur is often silent while riding, or quiet after a hard moment, or unable to say what needs saying. The journal fills some of those silences without breaking them. It gives the story a voice that does not need to interrupt the scene. This is why it feels so natural. It does not force Arthur to become talkative. It respects his nature while still letting us know him. The silence remains, but it is no longer empty. The journal's role as a collector of points of interest is one of its most revealing details. Arthur can find strange cabins, unusual landmarks, carvings, skeletons, abandoned structures, odd machines, and little mysteries that do not belong directly to Dutch's plans. When these discoveries enter the notebook, the world becomes more than a route between robberies. It becomes a place with forgotten corners. Arthur is not just passing through. He is quietly archiving the things official history may never care to keep. Dinosaur bones are a perfect example of that hidden archive. Scattered across the map, they belong to a time so ancient that Arthur's own century looks tiny beside it. When he records them, the outlaw story suddenly rests on top. The gang is worried about Pinkertons, money, camps, and escape, while the earth holds bones from creatures older than every human argument in the game. The journal lets that scale enter softly. Arthur's life is urgent, but the land has been remembering longer than any outlaw dream. The rock carvings carry a different kind of mystery. They are not simply natural remains, they are deliberate marks, strange images cut into stone, pulling Arthur into a story he cannot fully explain. The journal's record of them makes him feel like an accidental antiquarian. He is not a trained scholar. He does not have the language to solve everything he finds. But he looks, sketches, and preserves. That is enough to make him part of the mystery, without making him master of it. Dream catchers, too, fit the journal's quiet rhythm, because they ask Arthur to notice small handmade objects hidden in trees. They are easy to pass by, but the notebook rewards slowness. Their presence brings another layer of human memory into the landscape, craft, belief, protection, and loss. Arthur's world is full of violent men claiming land with guns and deeds, but dream catchers mark the world differently. They are delicate signs of people seeing meaning in branches, thread, feathers, and the space between. Treasure maps reveal a more playful and dangerous side of the journal. They turn Arthur's notebook into a companion for greed, curiosity, and puzzle solving. A line on paper points toward a rock, a tree, a cliff, a waterfall, a ruin, or a hidden place where money waits. Yet, even here, the journal changes the feeling of treasure. The reward is not, it is the act of reading land through marks, learning that a landscape can speak in riddles if someone has the patience to follow them. This is different from Dutch's obsession with one final score. Treasure maps are small, specific and grounded. Dutch's future money is always vague, always somewhere beyond the next disaster. A treasure map says, look at this hill, this bend, this stone, this drawing. It brings desire back down to earth. Arthur may still be chasing money, but the journal makes the chase attentive rather than delusional. It is one of the few forms of searching that asks him to see the world more clearly. The cigarette cards also belong to the journal's world of collecting, even though they have a different tone. They are commercial objects, little printed fragments of fame, industry, entertainment, and culture tucked into everyday life. Arthur collecting them feels almost strange, because it places him inside a consumer world he barely belongs to. The cards are mass-produced memory, while his journal is handmade memory. Side by side, they show two ways the age preserves what it values. Factories print heroes, and Arthur sketches what he personally. The journal's relationship to photography is worth pausing over. Red Dead Redemption 2 includes photographers and cameras, but Arthur's book remains built from hand and eye. A photograph captures quickly, mechanically, with light. A drawing takes time and interpretation. Arthur does not merely copy the world. He filters it through patience, skill, and mood. That is why his sketches feel intimate. They are not neutral images, they are encounters. A bird drawn by Arthur is a bird seen through Arthur. Albert Mason's photography makes this contrast especially gentle. Albert wants to preserve animals with a camera, while Arthur often preserves them with pencil. Both men are trying, in very different ways, to hold on to a vanishing wildness. Albert is awkward and enthusiastic, almost comically vulnerable. Arthur is hardened and capable, but secretly just as interested in what the animal. Their paths crossing feels right, because both are witnesses, even if only one of them would comfortably admit it. The journal's sketches of fish, especially around fishing trips, belong to another form of patience. Fishing is not dramatic in the way robbery is dramatic. It asks for quiet, weather, water, and waiting. Arthur's record of fish gives those pauses significance. The line cast into water becomes another pencil line across paper. Both are small acts of attention. Both require him to slow his hands. In a life full of recoil and impact, fishing and drawing let his hands do something gentler. The same is true of birds. Birds in the journal carry lightness, motion, and distance. Arthur watches them even though his own life keeps him tied to gang obligation. A bird can rise over a fence, a town, a field, or a swamp without asking permission. Arthur, who talks so much about freedom because Dutch taught him to, spends his private time drawing creatures that actually embody it. The irony is soft, but painful. He can sketch flight before he knows how to lead. Arthur's plant drawings and notes quietly challenge the idea that he is only a destroyer. To know herbs is to know use without always needing violence. A plant can be medicine, poison, food, scent, colour, or memory. The journal's attention to plants suggests a survival knowledge older than the gang's robberies. It connects Arthur to trappers, healers, hunters, travellers, and people who survive by knowing where to look. The outlaw carries a field guide. The journal also records places where the world feels almost too strange for the main story to hold. A meteor house, a strange statue puzzle, a lonely cabin with signs of madness, a place where something unexplained has happened. All these details let the map breathe outside realistic crime drama. Arthur's notebook does not turn him into a supernatural. It lets him be a man who finds odd things and draws them, because oddness deserves a mark too. That is one reason the journal never feels like pure exposition. It is not only there to explain, sometimes it is there to preserve uncertainty. Arthur can record a weird discovery without solving it. He can sketch a clue without knowing the whole story. This restraint gives the world dignity. Not everything exists, some things exist to remain strange in the corner of a page, like a memory that never quite settles. The journal's empty spaces matter as much as the filled ones. A notebook is always limited. Arthur cannot write every conversation, draw every tree, or confess every fear. There are gaps between entries, missing hours, unrecorded thoughts, things he chooses not to say, and things he may not understand yet. Those gaps make the book feel real. A complete journal would feel artificial. Arthur's journal is powerful because it is partial, like any human record. It leaves room for silence. The partial nature of the journal also respects Arthur's privacy. Even though the book reveals him, it does not expose him completely. Some feelings remain hidden. Some memories appear only indirectly. Isaac and Eliza, for example, haunt the story more than they fill the pages. Mary appears through old feeling and letters, but not every memory of love is written down. This means Arthur remains a person, not a solved puzzle. The journal brings us close without pretending closeness is ownership. The way the journal changes after important encounters gives it a living quality. It is not a static biography. It responds to experience. A new animal adds a sketch. A strange meeting adds a note. A painful mission changes the emotional pressure around later pages. Arthur's book becomes a nervous system for the story, registering small touches that the main plot might rush past. The notebook feels alive because the world is always pressing new marks. The journal also helps Arthur resist disappearing into Dutch's language. Dutch is always naming things: faith, freedom, civilization, betrayal, family, loyalty, noise. He names reality in ways that protect his authority. Arthur's journal names reality differently. It names through particular things: a sick man, a dead friend, a horse, a river, a street, a woman asking for help, a boy needing his father. Specificity becomes resistance. Dutch speaks in clouds. Arthur writes in web. This specificity is why the journal can be so calming, despite the violence around it. A specific thing gives the mind somewhere to rest. A feather, a bridge, a fish, a cabin, a face, a road curving into trees. The story may be collapsing, but the journal keeps returning to things that can be seen and held in thought. It slows panic by making the world concrete. Arthur may not know how to save himself, but he can still draw the shape of what is in front of him. In this way, the journal is almost a form of grounding for Arthur. He lives under constant threat: lawmen, rival gangs, hunger, weather, disease, Dutch's instability, Micah's malice, and his own guilt. Writing and drawing give him a small ritual of order. He cannot make the world safe, but he can put a piece of it on paper. That act is not therapy in a modern sense, but it carries a similar quiet function. It gives chaos a border. The journal's border is important, because Arthur's life has almost no stable boundaries. Camps move, plans change, families fracture, law closes in, illness enters his body. The notebook remains a contained space. Page after page, it offers a beginning and an end, a place where something can be held without immediately being lost. For a man whose whole life is motion, a page is a kind of room. This makes the journal one of Arthur's only true homes. Not home as a house, not home as land, not home as a legal name, but home as a private place where the self can return. Arthur cannot keep Eliza and Isaac. He cannot keep Mary. He cannot keep the gang. He cannot keep the camps. He cannot keep his health. But for much of the story, he can keep the journal. He can return to the page when every outer home fails. The journal's connection to home becomes sharper in the epilogue because John uses the same book while trying to build an actual one. Arthur's private home of paper moves toward John's physical home at Beecher's Hope. That movement is beautifully quiet. It suggests that before a house can be built, someone had to preserve enough memory, warning, and love to make the attempt matter. Arthur never lays every board of John's future, but his sacrifice and his journal help clear the ground. John's later entries in places Arthur never reached, or never fully knew, add a final layer of sadness. The book continues beyond Arthur's horizon. New Austin and the epilogue spaces feel sun-bleached, dry, and haunted by another chapter of the West. John can move through places Arthur's story did not fully occupy, carrying Arthur's book into landscapes. The journal goes farther than its first author. That is what inheritance often means. The object keeps travelling after the hand is gone. John's rougher drawings should not be treated as failure. They are evidence of difference and effort. Arthur's artistry was natural, almost hidden. John's marks feel less graceful, but they show him trying to inhabit the practice. That is moving, because grief often works through imperfect imitation. A person uses the dead person's tool, sits in the dead person's chair, repeats a habit badly at first, and somehow love is present in the awkwardness. John's pages are not Arthur's pages. That is why they hurt. The journal also makes Abigail's hope feel more grounded. She does not care about outlaw legend. She wants John alive, Jack safe, and a home that does not vanish at dawn. Arthur's book, full of failed camps and dying dreams, sits behind that hope like a warning. The pages know what happens when men choose fantasy over family. John's task is to read that warning with his life, not only his eyes. The epilogue is tense, because he partly learns, and partly does not. Jack, growing near the shadow of the journal, represents the future Arthur could only protect indirectly. Jack is tied to books from the beginning, more comfortable with reading than shooting, and that makes Arthur's notebook feel especially meaningful in the family's larger story. The boy Arthur once took fishing grows up surrounded by the written traces of violent men trying, badly and late, to become something better. The tragedy is that Jack inherits both the books and the blood. The journal's quietest legacy may therefore be not that it saves the Marstons, but that it tells the truth around them. It does not promise that John will escape consequence. It does not promise that Jack will remain untouched by violence. It does not promise that Abigail's dream will be permanently safe. It simply preserves the path by which Arthur chose them. The truth is not enough to stop history, but it is enough to make the choice. There is also a practical beauty in the journal's durability. It crosses snow, rain, mud, swamps, tropical heat, city smoke, and mountain cold. It survives gunfights, shipwreck, sickness, betrayal, and death. This survival is not realistic in every tiny sense, but emotionally it feels right. The book endures because memory endures in the story. Bodies fail, but traces remain. Arthur's breath gives out, but the page keeps holding the line his hand once made. The journal's physical journey mirrors Arthur's moral journey. At first, it is carried by a man serving the gang. Later, it is carried by a man questioning the gang. Finally, it is given away by a man choosing against the gang's selfish survival. The object does not change shape, but its meaning changes. The same notebook that once rode with Dutch's enforcer becomes the notebook that leaves Dutch behind. That change is why the journal feels so central to Arthur's redemption. Redemption is not only in the grand final sacrifice, it is in the reorientation of everything he carries. His gun, his horse, his satchel, his money, his strength, his knowledge, and his journal all move from serving Dutch's dream to serving John's escape. The book is part of that reorientation. It stops being merely Arthur's private place and becomes a gift. The gift is especially moving because Arthur has so little time left to decide what matters. People often imagine legacy as something built over many peaceful years. Arthur's legacy is built under pressure, in sickness, while being hunted after terrible mistakes. The journal shows that even a late legacy can be real. A page written near the end still counts. A kindness done after cruelty still lands somewhere. A warning given with a failing voice can still be heard. Arthur's journal teaches that a life is not understood only by... Without the notebook, people might remember the mountain and think they know him. With the notebook, the mountain becomes the final page of a much longer inner record. We see the child he was, the artist he hid, the violence he normalised, the people he loved, the beauty he noticed, the guilt he carried, and the slow way his soul turned toward mercy. The ending matters more, because the pages came first. There is a special kind of peace in imagining the journal closed after John has written in it. Not finished exactly, because memory is never finished, but resting. Arthur's hand is gone. John's hand has continued. The pages hold two lives and the space between them. Somewhere beyond the book are the roads, rivers, towns, graves, animals and mountains it tried to preserve. The world moves on, but inside the notebook, the passing things remain still enough to be remembered. There is a special sadness in imagining Arthur writing by low light after camp has settled. People nearby are sleeping, drinking, arguing softly, cleaning guns, or staring into fire. Somewhere Dutch is planning, somewhere Micah is poisoning, somewhere John is failing. Arthur sits with the book, perhaps coughing later, perhaps rubbing tired eyes, perhaps pretending none of it matters too much. The pencil moves. A life that cannot stop moving finally pauses long enough to leave a trace. The trace is humble. That humility is part of its greatness. Arthur does not carve his name into history as a general or politician. He does not win. He does not become famous within the world for his art. He leaves a notebook. And yet that notebook may be the truest record of him. In a story filled with men who want monuments, plans, legends, revenge, money and control, Arthur's most meaningful legacy is a private collection of pages. The journal also gives the ending a gentler afterlife. Arthur dies, but later the book can be opened. A drawing, a note can be read. A page can return the feeling of his hand. That is what real grief often does with objects. The dead are not present, but their handwriting can make presence flare for a moment. Red Dead Redemption 2 understands that. It lets Arthur's memory live not as a statue, but as something paper-thin and deeply personal. If Arthur's life, the journal is the proof that tragedy is not the same as emptiness. His life contains terrible harm, but also perception, tenderness, humour, skill, care, and late courage. The book does not cancel the harm, it refuses emptiness. That refusal is why Arthur's story stays with people so strongly. He is not remembered only because he is remembered because, through the journal, we know what kind of person was lost when he died. The journal's final meaning may be this: Arthur Morgan spent much of his life believing he was a bad man doing what bad men do. But the pages show a man who kept noticing good things, kept being moved by them, kept recording them, even when he did not believe. That small, stubborn attention was a seed of redemption long before he knew what to call it. By the time he gives the journal to John, the seed has become action. And so the journal is not only Arthur's memory, it is his slow awakening. It begins as a travel companion for an outlaw and becomes the private record of a conscience. It holds snow, horses, rivers, jokes, towns, strangers, dead friends, old love, sickness, fear, and the final turn toward mercy. It is the quietest voice in a loud story, and maybe the most honest one. Dutch speaks, Micah sneers, the law shouts, guns answer. But Arthur's journal simply keeps the truth, page after page. Now the campfire can settle lower, the pencil can rest beside the page. Somewhere in the dark, the horses shift softly, and the roads Arthur drew stretch away. The book remains closed for tonight, but what it holds is still there. The life of a man who saw more beauty than he knew how to claim, caused more pain than he knew how to carry, and still found near the end a way to leave something gentler behind. Arthur Morgan's journal is not a perfect confession. It is better than that. It is a human trace, a record of seeing, changing, and let the pages grow quiet now. Let the last ember breathe. Let the hills fade into the dark. Rest easy, and let the notebooks